I'd also like to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to speak. Usually mid-century modernism is something that I do teach in my classes. However, it's not a field of research or specialization for me. So when they asked me to talk about this particular exhibition, I was thrilled because it was going to give me a chance to go back and put some of the objects that are exhibited and to think about modern design within a historical context. So I titled this talk Thinking Globally. In other words, thinking in larger international terms about design, especially interiors, architecture, and industrial design objects. But I thought of this also as more of a kind of theoretical or conceptual paper, that instead of looking at just objects, and I do have plenty of slides, I swear, that I was going to talk about ideas and how you can see ideas percolating in different areas of the world and how they sort of come together in this culmination of mid-century modern design that's on display now at the Graham. So I will start now. One of the questions that the exhibition asks is, what is modern? What does it mean to be modern? Of course, this is a brochure from the exhibition, and one of the things that the exhibition is arguing is that Michigan modern design came together because of people who happened to be here, but it was also spurred by industrialization because of the automotive industry, and of course that's very much part of what the exhibition is showing us. In this particular page, a spread from Better Homes and Gardens, it gives the impression that anyone can have access to modern design. And this is also one of the ideas that comes out of modern design in the 20th century. That design is going to be for the benefit of all. It can be transferred to different spaces. It's also something that even the typical American housewife should be able to put together into a unified interior. So this is a little bit of a I don't want to say propaganda, but it's very much selling modernism to the average consumer in the 1950s. And of course, the 1950s in the United States were a time of economic prosperity. The United States after World War II really rose to the fore in the economy and also in world politics. The rest of the world, for the most part, was still dealing with the consequences of World War II. The U.S. recovered economically fairly quickly in the late 1940s, and this is one of the things that led to this desire on the part of most American consumers to be mired in, to be exposed to modern design. So I just wanted to start off with this idea that modernism was not something in terms of design and architecture that was necessarily elite or aloof from most people, but it was very much part of the everyday. And I think that's a little bit of a different concept than what most people think of when they think of modern art. If you think about in the 1940s and 1950s, one of the key theorists in the United States, excuse me, who wrote about modern art was a man named Clement Greenberg. And Greenberg, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with his name, is one of the people who really campaigned for the appreciation of artists such as Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. One of the things that Greenberg was adamant about was that modernism was a new trend in the visual arts. It may have had its roots in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, modern art was about exploring these different media. So for the arts, painting meant an accentuation of flatness and looking at the formal means of the arts. So you have on the one hand, theorists who are thinking about the fine arts as being really separate from the other arts and also emphatically non-utilitarian. Now, Greenberg, on the other hand, was a bit of a snob, and he really was. I know that's saying it mildly. I know. If anyone has read Greenberg, you know that he is not particularly interested in industrialization. He actually thinks of the fine arts as something that should be preserved. from the muckiness of commercial relations. And so he even, in a couple of landmark essays, writes about avant-garde art as being something that is different from what he terms as kitsch. So anything that's not avant-garde is kitsch. Everything that, for example, Norman Rockwell illustrations, television, of course, pop art, that has a sort of taint of commercialism, for him is not worthy of our attention. Now, modern design, I think, is one of the trends in the arts, and I do think of design as being under this larger umbrella of the arts that really challenges Greenberg's short-sightedness, his narrow-mindedness, because design combines industrialization, commercialization with avant-garde ideas, and this is precisely what I would like to talk about today. So I'm going to show you some examples of what I see are being key concepts behind modern design from looking at a couple of different case studies. So if we start off with this idea of what is modern, well, modern can simply be, according to some historians, just a period of time. We can even, it's debatable at this point whether or not we're still in the modern period. Are we in a contemporary period? Does the modern period begin, say, the early modern period in the Italian Renaissance when you start seeing the development of capitalism? It's very definitely in full swing when you get into the 18th century, when you have industrialization, and also by the French Revolution, when there starts to be a replacement of these older institutions such as monarchies, the court, and even in the 19th century, disintegration of certain types of arts institutions. For example, the academy in the 19th century is not, by the end of the 19th century, is not nearly as important as it had been before. So that's one aspect of the modern. The modern can also be, as you can see at the Graham, an approach to design. The talk earlier today that we just came from talked about modern as being an architectural style. However, and one of the things that I'm trying to advocate today is the modern can also be a new sensibility, a new way of thinking about people's place in the world, and also what is their relationship to material culture and objects around them. So one of the things that I'm fascinated about during this period, especially even in the late 19th century, is that people start to think of or one idea that's the foundation of modern design is to think of design, and I have that in quotes and I'll explain that in a minute, is something that can be for the greater good, something that everyone should have access to, and something that should be integrated into everyday life. Now, I have design in quotes because around 1880, 1890, this period that I'm going to start talking about, and I'll go through the early part of the 20th century, they didn't necessarily use the term design for everyday objects, for things that were supposed to be artistically designed. Instead, they used a number of catchphrases, and one of them was applied arts, decorative arts, industrial arts. They use a number of different things because they really don't know what to call what we would say today are design objects. Instead, there was a hierarchy of the arts. And you would have the fine arts, which were painting, sculpture, architecture, and then you have the applied arts, which were usually things like interiors, decoration, anything that would go into the home. And that is one of the holdovers from the older academic system. And this starts to disintegrate by the late 19th century. So I'm going to talk about these different test cases, Art Nouveau in France, De Stijl in the Netherlands, Constructivism in the Soviet Union, and also the Bauhaus in Germany as being key cases in which there are new ideas that are presented in relation to how we think about design as being integrated into everyday life. We'll also see that one of the main things that is put forth in this period is also how do you combine the arts with industrialization? Because there were plenty of painters and artists who were still and Greenberg writes about them, who are thinking of themselves as being somewhat removed from society, somewhat removed from those commercial and industrial relationships, but nevertheless there were plenty of other people who were associated with avant-garde movements, and this is just a smattering of them. There's lots of them that I'm not going to be talking about, who are trying to find a way of bringing those things together. So the first example I want to talk about is Art Nouveau, or what's called New Art in France. And one of the people who writes about Art Nouveau in France is a critic named Roger Marx. Now, Roger Marx is not a designer. He's actually, at this point, we would probably call him an upper-level bureaucrat. He is someone who is working for the federal government in France. He is working for what is a new regime that had just come in to France in 1871. And he is at one point the director of museums. He's responsible for organizing a couple of universal expositions, those huge world fairs that were formed in Paris. One of them was in 1889, another in 1900. And because he had access to federal funds, but also because he was such an important person, he's someone who becomes an advocate for what is at this time termed the decorative arts, but really talking about design. And he is especially important for advocating for Art Nouveau. He loves Art Nouveau. He believes that this is going to be the direction of the future. He also sees what we would refer to as design, or what he calls the decorative arts, as a way of ameliorating people's lives. He really believes that if you have objects that people have access to every day that have been designed with aesthetics in mind, you can change their lives. It's a utopian idea, and I say utopian. He's not a socialist. He is, at the time, he's referred to as a radical Republican, not like our GOP. Okay, this is different. It's France, but he still believes in democracy. He doesn't believe that the state needs to take over businesses or anything like that. But he really wants to promote this idea. And one way that he promotes this idea is he's a prolific writer. I don't know how he did this, how he could have a regular bureaucratic position, organize all these exhibitions, and also write on the side, but he is incredibly prolific. He was the editor for a major art journal called Gazette des Beaux-Arts that survived really up until, I think, about 2003. And he wrote, he commissioned many articles to go in about the decorative arts and design. He also wrote a book called L'Art Social, or Social Art. So he talks about Art Nouveau under this umbrella of what he calls social art. And social art for him can be a number of things. It can be architecture that is designed with modern principles in mind for the poor. It could be Dance by Louis Fuller. I'm going to show you some other examples of art social that he writes about, because he writes about a number of architects he works with. But he also believes that the graphic arts, anything that somebody has access to, can change their sensibilities. Now, he's writing at a time when there's a lot of concern about French workers. He starts writing in the 1880s, and this is not very long after there had been a major uprising in Paris. There was the Paris Commune of 1870, 1871, and this had actually happened when France was at war with Germany. And Germany invaded France and had a siege around the city of Paris. Paris had an enormous wall that was still around it. It had, and actually there were a number of artists who were sequestered in Paris during this time. Manet was one, and Degas was, and they would actually, they were given rifles and they would go out to the embankments and defend against the Germans. And so Paris was under siege for a number of months. It created enormous hardships, and it also created a lot of anxiety for the people there. They couldn't get a lot of news about what was going on in the rest of the country. So the emperor, who had been responsible for really instigating a war with Germany, ended up surrendering. And the Parisians were furious at this. They could not believe that the rest of the country had capitulated to the Germans while they had been sitting there for months eating all kinds of things in order to survive. Supposedly the rat population diminished to 0 in Paris during this period. And so what they did is they formed their own government. And it was a workers' control government. It was eventually very harshly suppressed by the new regime that came in. But this was always something that was in the back of the minds of this new government, the Third Republic that came in. What are they going to do about workers? When the Commune was suppressed, it's estimated between 20 and 30,000 people were either killed in battle, pitched battles in the streets of Paris, or either taken to Père Lachaise Cemetery and shot up against a wall. So suddenly, you know, this is always in the minds of the government. If you have people who are deprived, if you have people who have no access to education, if you have people who have no access to the arts, there's always this worry. I mean, on the one hand, Marx was somebody who wanted to improve their lives, but he also wanted to make sure that they were taken care of. So something like this would never happen again. The Third Republic was always really concerned about this, the first few decades that it is in power. How do we keep people happy so a Paris Commune can never happen again? So this is part of what he's writing about and what he funds in terms of the sponsorship of different programs. So you may be wondering, well, why is Marx somebody who wants to try to modernize art or modernize the decorative arts in Paris? Wasn't this already a modern city? It definitely was going through a period of modernization during this period, starting in about 1860. The previous government that was controlled by an emperor basically went through and raised whole areas of the city in order to make the streets very straight, to have areas where carts could get through, where there would also be a kind of uniformity in terms of the way that the city was laid out. And this is called Housmanization. The person who was in charge of it was an engineer named Baron Haussmann, and he was the one who really came up with this concept of how do you make Paris into this beautiful city. Now I'm showing you one slide from an aerial view so you can see what they were doing in terms of how they even designed the streets. In the middle of that plaza, you can see that there is the Paris Opera House, and this was again designed during this period. And the streets are even to converge upon that so that you can see the Opera House from different points of view. When you're also looking from a bird's eye view, you can see how homogeneous the architecture looks. And so when they raised these older areas of Paris, and Paris was still very much a sort of older medieval city before this, they put up these new apartment buildings that had very strict codes in terms of how many stories, how many balconies, exactly how it was supposed to look. A lot of people thought that this was incredibly boring. There were a lot of complaints about Haussmanization at the end of the 19th century. And they also complained about how everything was this sort of white stone. It was this Beaux-Arts architecture that today when you go to Paris, the Americans ooh and ah over it. But in the 19th century, the Parisians hated it. They'd taken all the character out of these older neighborhoods and given them something that was sort of cookie cutter, the way that they thought about it. So, one of the things that Marx wants to do, he wants to introduce different ideas about modern architecture and to get away with this sort of academic Beaux-Arts model. Instead, he wants to do something different. Now, another thing is also going on that not every neighborhood in Paris had been Haussmanized. There were still a number of these neighborhoods that looked like this, that were kind of filthy. And you can see that the architecture, even some of the facades look like they're leaning forward. Most people who were living in these working class areas had no plumbing inside their homes. They often would have to go to a street urinal in order to sometimes to wash themselves, sometimes to use the bathroom. There was no electricity. So a lot of these places were also associated with disease, with outbreaks of tuberculosis. There were a very high number of taverns and bars in these places. And again, these were areas where working class people would have congregated, where they would have come together. This was a problem. So eventually these areas were cleaned up. And if you ever go to Paris today, the Marais is really one of the only areas that still looks like that sort of older Paris. It has winding streets, they're narrow. The rest of Paris very much has this stamp of Haussmanization, a kind of modernization of the European city that was followed by a number of cities during this period. So, in this aspect of modernization, Art Nouveau is going to be one of the alternatives that people could turn to in order to design architecture, to design objects. Now, one of the things about Art Nouveau, and this is where we come in with the concepts actually predate the realization. They wanted to completely do away with this older hierarchy of painting, sculpture, architecture as being separate, and then you have these lesser arts, the applied arts, the industrial arts. They believed everything should be on the same level. And so part of this also has to do with an idea of the democratization of the arts. Not only do you not have a hierarchy of the arts that puts some things as being superior to others, but you try to find a way of manufacturing them so more people in society have access to them. And Marx is one of these people who talks time and time again that art should not be locked in the gilded cage of the museum. Even though there were salons that were free to the public, it still, for the most part, was conceived of only being for the upper crust or for the upper middle class. So it's a new style of interior decoration. It wants to completely do away with historicist or revivalist styles. And the revivalist styles really is what predominated furniture manufacturing in France during this period. It was a period, because of industrialization, that many of the furniture manufacturers who had specialized in handicraft for centuries, and a lot of them lived in Paris in this one little region of Paris, they were very radicalized, they started losing their jobs. Everybody started losing their jobs. Printmakers started losing their jobs. So this was a way of presenting to the modern consumer a new style that could also find a way of bringing art and industry together. So functionality is something that had to be inseparable from beauty. It gets away from the industrial model where the only thing that matters is how cheaply you can produce something and send it out to the public. So the quality of the arts is very important. I want to show you just one example of French Art Nouveau. And I know when you look at this, you're like, is this really accessible to the modern public? No, it is not. And this is a problem. You have the idea and then you have the realization, right? So the idea is, and you can see this at least in here, that you do have a combination of all the arts, right? It is a complete unity of the interior. And in this particular interior, Villain designs everything that you see here. He designed the light fixtures, he designed the ceilings, he designed the furniture, he designed the surround for the fireplace. Everything is part of a unified whole. You can also see that he's not using a kind of historicist or a revivalist style. Instead, for Art Nouveau, many of these people were looking to organic forms, and they're not always obvious organic forms. Some of them are flowers, which you can see in the light fixtures, but others are stems of flowers that are very curvilinear and sort of wind their way throughout this interior. Now this one is made of wood, and of course Art Nouveau is fascinated with fidelity to materials. They want the materials to be shown. They hated things like veneers. They hated things like faux painted boards that look like marble. That was dishonest to them. So the materials themselves are something that is going to be showcased. And so this is one aspect of it. The private interior that was, part of was patronized by people who were fairly wealthy. This is also in Nancy. And Nancy was a hotbed. It was a center of handicrafts during this period. It was also where Roger Marx came from. So there's a really, clear connection here with Nancy and the decorative arts. However, something that's maybe a little bit more ordinary, and also definitely a building that Roger Marx wrote about, is this, Les Samaritaines, which is a department store that was designed by Franz Jourdan. Franz Jourdan is from a whole family of architects. His son and his grandson went on to be architects, and he was a friend of Roger Marx. He also writes a lot about the decorative arts during this period. And Jourdan is somebody who absolutely believes, fine, you can use rosewood all you want to, you can have that beautiful walnut, oak, whatever, in interior, but we live in a modern age. That means you've got to use modern materials. And so he uses a lot of metal and glass in his design. And he also is not someone who's going to shy away from a commercial building. So this is what he comes up with. Jourdan is also, like Marx is fascinated about street culture in Paris and how are you going to engage the modern spectator, some of them who are walking around and sort of tuned out because a lot of the architecture looks the same. So he wants to infuse a sense of color and decoration into this, but again, most of it is sort of organic, it's a little bit toned down. It's not that same sort of Beaux-Arts sort of exuberant architecture. Now, there's not a lot of Art Nouveau architecture. I say not a lot. I mean, there are some buildings in Paris. It was sometimes difficult to get things built. Some things were built as temporary buildings, but one lasting legacy of Art Nouveau and the ideas behind Art Nouveau are these subway surrounds. They were designed by Hector Guimard around 1900 when the subway was being built in Paris. It's one of the oldest subway systems in the world. And again, it was something that was supposed to announce this modern development of a subway in a way that would reflect the industrial world. So it uses those industrial materials of metal and glass. Even the typography that you have over the sign that says Métropolitain, which, metro or subway, also reflects a sort of interest in non-historicized styles. These are absolutely gorgeous. There's only 2 originals that are left. At one point, and I gotta say this, I'm sorry, but around the mid-century, they were seen as hopelessly old-fashioned. A lot of them were torn down. And so at this point, they've been able to go back and retro-design those, and you start to see them more and more around Paris now, where they've got them installed in just about every subway station. Marx also loved the work of Émile Gallet, who was a glass artist in Nancy. He also especially appreciated posters. He felt that you shouldn't be a snob about what you were going to advocate for people. The idea was taste, not what it was made of. So a poster artist like Jules Charest, who basically was a commercial artist, he had almost no education in the fine arts, but he had been designing posters for 20 or 30 years. His posters were everywhere in Paris. Marx says that if people would just go out and walk around in the streets, they would actually get an aesthetic education almost unconsciously. In other words, they would sort of absorb these ideas from well-designed posters. So I'm showing you one of Charest's posters in this. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the wall, it's actually one of the posters that is posted up. So these were not things that were supposed to be locked away in a museum. They were posted up. They were put up with a kind of paste, then torn down after a few days. So even something like this, ephemera, was part of the Art Nouveau idea. Some of these ideas were actually more fully realized in Belgium than they were in France. And one of the Belgians, Victor Horta, this is just one of the interiors that he designed, Texel House in Belgium. If you ever get to Brussels, I feel like we've got a field trip in the making. If you ever get to Brussels, I think they have better Art Nouveau there within a smaller period, and Horta is somebody who really left his stamp on that city. He is, again, fascinated with more sort of humble materials, using mosaics, wrought iron, glass, and also using things like paint in this, again, curvilinear Art Nouveau style where everything is harmonized as a whole. This building is now owned by a law firm, so I don't have slides from the rest of it, but even Horta's house, he built a house for himself, is accessible. It's been completely renovated. It is absolutely gorgeous. His attention to detail, he designed everything, tile, all the doorknobs. They have some of the furniture that he designed. This is the burden of the Art Nouveau designer and architect. They do it all. And it's not necessarily mass manufactured. It's more of a sort of smaller workshop manufacturer. So this is one reason why it was difficult for these things to be built, and some of them don't exist. Now, you're probably thinking, some of these ideas sound vaguely familiar. And it's true that the arts and crafts is lurking within the Art Nouveau. They come about the same time. And William Morris is the person who came up with the idea of arts and crafts. Again, taking this hierarchy of the arts, reversing it, wanting to have a unity of the arts, fidelity in the materials, all of this is part of the arts and crafts. Here's an important distinction, though. William Morris is always looking back to the past, always. He believes the medieval period is where there is this grain of truth. Before industrialization, this is when people cared about objects, and he advocates a return to handicraft. And he also advocates a return to history for inspiration. This is his house that was designed by Philip Webb, and the interior, Morris participated with a number of artists in order to design it. And I'm sorry, my slide is a little bit pink. These are just exposed wooden rafters there. They're not painted pink or anything, but you can see the simplicity there. And Morris, within a very short period of time, he actually, for the early part of his life, was more of a poet, and he dabbled in painting and all kinds of things. And then he really comes into his own with arts and crafts ideas. He starts lecturing around the country, and again, he wants to find a way of ameliorating these problems for workers. That if you train them in handicrafts, that's a way that they can be engaged in their work. It's a completely different idea from Marx. Marx, on the other hand, believes that workers, if they have somebody who is in charge of the design, he doesn't call it design, but what he's really talking about, he calls them artists, entrepreneurs, somebody at the top who can create an idea and show the workers how to realize it through industrial manufacturing, then that would actually improve their lives, right? Morris, on the other hand, is like, no, everything needs to be made by hand. This is the machine is evil, and this is the only way that you can really sort of recuperate design for Morris. So this is where the two ideas really split. Now, I'm going to move on to a couple of other movements just very quickly. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. And one of them is Constructivism in the Soviet Union. Now, I've been talking about late 19th century as being the really sort of on the cusp of modern design. But by 1900, obviously, mass production was somewhat limited. And France is always, always, always interested in this idea. They're looking at Germany, they're looking at France, they're looking at Great Britain and thinking about how can they be competitive in the world. But they really were still lagging behind a little bit. So in the 20th century, most designers are interested in, again, how do you make objects that are going to convey your period, the modern period, when all of a sudden there is the production of cars, there's even flight, trains are going faster, all of these things were supposed to be expressed in these objects. So Constructivism is another movement, and it's in the Soviet Union that is a major step forward in terms of how people conceive of design objects in everyday life. So Constructivism comes about basically right after the Soviet Revolution. And I usually have to tell my students an awful lot about the Soviet Revolution because they've never heard of the Cold War or the USSR. None of this stuff ever existed, but I will skip over that for you guys because I'm assuming that most of you know what this is about. And of course, this is Lenin speaking to the people. One of the things that happens, though, immediately after the Soviet Revolution, right at the end of World War I, Russia pulls out, and they're having massive economic problems. Oh, thank you. And what they basically do is decide that they're going to have to come up with a new art to express this new society. And the Constructivists are the ones who are behind that. They absolutely believe that art should be useful. In fact, they ban the use of the word art because they don't like this association with it being removed from everyday life. So Constructivism, again, some of their ideas are not necessarily realized in architecture, but nevertheless they have some important, crucial ideas about making things that are useful, making things that are streamlined, simple, basic design, again, that are going to express this new society. And they hate the past. It absolutely is something that's about this bourgeois past that has to be eradicated. Alexander Rachenko is one of the leaders of this movement. You see him here dressed in his own coveralls that he designed, looking like a worker, not somebody who is dabbling in paint. This is one of the interiors that he designed in Paris for the 1925 exhibition. This is where we get the term Art Deco, for art décoratif. And this was for a workers' club where people could go in and read party literature, Communist Party literature, be inspired. They could have a projection of film on one wall. This is just to let you know what the colors are. Of course, the color scheme is vital. Everything is red. In most of this constructivist work, it's supposed to promote the Bolshevik cause. But this was sort of a multi-purpose room, and it was also modular, so it could be taken apart and put together. Very, very simple, and again, but would expose people to ideas about design. Even in the graphic arts, the constructivists believed in absolute simplicity in geometry and limited color palette as a way of expressing those ideas. Believe it or not, this is a propaganda poster that is about the Soviet Civil War between the whites, the Mensheviks, and the Reds, the Bolsheviks, that is expressed in a way that's completely abstract. So the constructivists are fascinated by the idea of abstracted or non-objective visual language as a way of communicating to anyone. At this point at the revolution, most Russians were illiterate. So having a lot of text there was no point. Instead, they believed that geometry would be a kind of universal language that anybody would be able to tap into and anybody would be able to read. De style is influenced in Amsterdam by the constructivists, and they are trading back and forth these ideas. Some of the Soviet constructivists are going back and forth between Russia and Germany, Russia and the Netherlands, and so there really is this confluence of ideas. De style is also fascinated by using abstract geometry and primary colors in particular in order to express their ideas. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with the work of Piet Mondrian, but Mondrian was working with these other architects, these other designers, and again, it was not supposed to be painting as being separate from architecture or other aspects of design, but they were all supposed to be together. They take the name de style, or style, from this particular publication, which started to be published in 1917. And it had a number of people who published it again that were promoting modern architecture and modern design. Just to remind you what Piet Mondrian's work looked like, he goes through a series of essentializing natural aspects, but maintaining that there is a kind of spiritual and mathematical order that you could divine from looking at nature. And again, he is using this sort of hard-edge geometry. I also love to show his studio because that explains everything to me. Complete control in the way that he painted his work. Now, the three-dimensional architectural expression of de style is this work, or this building, Schroeder House, that was commissioned for a widow and her 3 children. Gerhard Rietveld knew her very well, and it was put on the end of attached homes in a residential neighborhood. But you can see in the expression of architecture how these ideas from painting are expressed. On the one hand, it has these private areas that are cordoned off, but it also has a sort of open concept here. It's very, very simple, but this was supposed to serve as a model for solving some of these problems of how do you create housing that is going to ameliorate people's lives, right? There's lots of light that comes in. You don't have that sort of dankness. You have every facility that you need. You have the heat. You have running water. You have a very simple bed that is there. Everything is arranged in a way so that it fits together. And the chair itself also expresses those same ideas. And this is Rietveld's very famous chair, and another part of the interior. The Bauhaus also assimilates many of these ideas from constructivism and also de style. I think many of you are probably familiar with Bauhaus, and so maybe I don't need to go over it so much. But nevertheless, it is in the Bauhaus, especially in its de style manifestation, where all of these ideas come together, where they start to mass manufacture things that are designed by students at the Bauhaus. And They, again, express design as something that's pared down, that is very geometrical, that has very little ornamentation. But I think the idea behind it is still there, lurking from the Art Nouveau period. Even though the Art Nouveau still, has a lot of decoration, all of this is still based on that if you can mass manufacture objects in a way that's well designed, has utility, that it will ameliorate people's lives. Just a few more slides. The Bauhaus, I know that mostly, it was the idea of having architecture as an umbrella for all of the other arts, but nevertheless, everything had to fit together, even the typography that was on the buildings. It was designed by one of their students and then faculty members named Herbert Bayer, and Bayer also was fascinated with this idea about democracy and expressing progressive ideas in design. This is one of his typography that he designed. He was insistent that there should not be capital letters because he felt that it would be too intimidating for certain people in society, especially for children. They were, and German has like how many words have capital letters in them? It's confusing, right? All the nouns have capital letters. So he felt that this was a way of completely simplifying everything. And you can see how he's also straining to use these geometric forms in the design of the typography. But of course, the Bauhaus is also manufacturing these beautiful industrial objects, and many of them were put into mass production in Dessau, which was an industrial city, and sold in different shops. Now, of course, I did want to show you this tea service by one of the women who was at the Bauhaus. There are many, many females who studied there, but this is one of the few women who studied in the metals workshop, Marianne Brandt. The issue with the Bauhaus is not that they weren't able to bring together these ideas for a successful model, is that they were constantly persecuted by the Nazis. They had their funding cut in Weimar in the first years that they were there. They were always being accused of being too progressive. They had socialist directors of the school, and so in 1933 they decided to completely shut it down. However, Germany's loss was our gain, and this is one of the topics that is evidently currently being explored in an exhibition in California, I believe, at the Museum of Contemporary Jewish Art, about the immigrants who revitalized design in the United States. Not that there wasn't wonderful design here already, but they do bring with them their progressive ideas, and they bring with them their know-how, and they bring with them this model of the Bauhaus. So this is just a short list of some of the artists who immigrated because of Nazi persecution in the 1930s. One of them, of course, is Mies van der Rohe, who is a former director of the Bauhaus. There are many other designers who also came to the United States, Alan Lustig, and Mies van der Rohe goes to Chicago, and again, as part of, and brings his international style of architecture to Chicago and leaves an indelible mark on that city. Now, in terms of Michigan, Marcel Brauer is one of the architects who, again, studied at the Bauhaus, taught at the Bauhaus, and then brings the ideas of the Bauhaus to Michigan. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar, at least we heard earlier today, saw some of the examples of Breuer's architecture. So I just want to wrap this up by saying that what I've been showing you today are just some of these progressive ideas about how you can unify art and industry into a way that will transform everyday life. And this is, I think, an idea that still needs to be celebrated and is on display at the Michigan Modern exhibition. Thank you.